Hi! Welcome back! So in the last video, we looked at an introduction to the Python for Machine Learning series, where I introduced the 4 libraries we'll be exploring, as well as the basics of each of them. We also went over some installation instructions. So if you don't have NumPy, Pandas, Matplotlib, or Seaborn installed, I highly suggest you check out my last video and get an introduction as well as those libraries installed, so that you'll be ready to go for this video, where we'll dive into NumPy. So in this video, we'll be exploring the basics of NumPy, and we'll be taking a look at NumPy arrays. Our lesson structure is outlined here. We'll first go into NumPy arrays using Python lists and matrices. And then we'll be going into NumPy arrays using built-in NumPy functions, NumPy array methods and attributes, and finally we'll be looking at how to create random NumPy arrays. And with that, let's jump right in. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do is import NumPy. And we're going to import it as a variable, and we're going to call it NP. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is turn a Python list into a NumPy array. And so we're going to do this by creating a variable called ARR and writing np.array, which is basically creating something into a NumPy array. And we're going to input a Python list 10, 20, 30. And now we can print this out and see how it looks. And it looks like a list, but the difference is this is actually a NumPy array, so we can perform operations on this array that we couldn't do if it was just a Python list. And we'll explore these operations in a later video. So the next thing we're going to do is create a variable called mat, which is short for matrix, and we're basically going to turn a list of Python lists into a multi-dimensional NumPy array. So we can type in the variable name in the cell, and it outputs this nice matrix-looking array. Now notice how we didn't say print mat, and so that's why it has the array in front of it. But if we say print mat, then it'll remove the array word, and it'll just output a matrix, just like that. So now we're going to explore some basic built-in methods that are specific to NumPy. So the first is np.zeros. And this one is pretty self-explanatory. It outputs an array with zeros. And the number in the parameter indicates how many elements you have in your list. The next one we're going to look at is np.zeros, but with 2 parameters. And this one is basically going to output a multi-dimensional array, all with zeros again. And it will kind of have the same layout as our mat variable above, because they're both multi-dimensional arrays. And the next one is np.ones, and this one is also pretty self-explanatory. As you can see, it outputs an array with ones. And we can again do that multi-dimensional form of it. So the next built-in function we're going to look at is np.I, which basically outputs an identity matrix that has the number of rows and number of columns as what you specify in the parameter. And you can look up what an identity matrix is on your own. I won't go into that in this video, but basically just know that it kind of acts as like an inverse matrix. So I'll write it right here, and you can look this up if you're not familiar with it. So the next function that we're going to look at is np.arrange, which is a really handy function because you basically enter a number and it creates an array of that length for you. It starts from 0 and goes all the way up to 1 before the number that you type in. And notice how that has 10 elements, which is what you've specified in the parameter. So you can go ahead and check that out by typing in AR equals np.arrange and then 10 in the bracket, or in the parentheses, and seeing what it outputs. And we can also try changing this to 8 and seeing what it outputs, and this will just be an array from 0 to 7, which has 8 elements. So the next thing we're going to look at is the same function, but with 2 parameters. And this one is basically going to start at the value you specify and end at the value you specify. So the first number in your parameter is going to be the initial starting number, and the last number is going to be what you stop with in your array. And what this is going to do is it's basically just going to create an array of whatever length it takes to get from the starting to the end. And it's integer based, so it just goes number to number until it reaches the end. So for the np.arrange function, we can also supply 3 parameters. So one way to see kind of how many parameters and what types we need, we can do Shift-Tab, and that'll bring up this docstring where we can observe what parameters it can take. So we see start, stop, and step. So we've explored start and stop, and now we're going to look at what step means. So let's start out with the same 5 and 20. But then we'll add a 4 at the end this time, and we'll see what happens. So we see that this array also starts with a 5, so that stays the same. But we see that it kind of increments by 4 every time. So 5 plus 4 is 9, 9 plus 4 is 13, 13 plus 4 is 17. So the 4 at the end kind of indicates what it was saying before, the step, which is kind of how much it adds every time. And it only ends at 17 because once you add 4 to 17, it exceeds 20, which we don't want. Okay, so now we're going to look at ar.reshape. So this is another built-in function of the NumPy package. So what this does is it kind of reshapes an array. So previously we had just an array with 1 row and 10 columns, which was what AR was initially. But now that we've reshaped it to have 2 rows and 5 columns, we're still going to have all our elements, but they're just kind of rearranged. So one way to see if a reshape will work is if both the values multiply to the original parameter. So 2 times 5 is 10, 5 times 2 is 10, so both of those work. And we can actually see the shape of this, and it'll just output 2, 5, because that is the shape of our reshaped array. 2 rows and 5 columns. And we can also try outputting 110, which is going to output the same thing as we had before when we had np.arrange and a 10 in there. Basically 1 row and 10 columns. And we can also try rearranging this version, and we can say 10, 1 instead, which will be 10 rows and 1 column. So you can kind of just see how we're reshaping the same array, basically that has the same elements, because 10 times 1 is 10, 1 times 10 is 10, 2 times 5 is 10, and 5 times 2 is 10. So here are just a few more functions that are pretty handy. So this one is self-explanatory. It finds the max in your array. So in this case, that is 9. And then we're also going to do the same thing to find the index of the max. And in this case, it's also going to be 9 because our indices actually line up with exactly what numbers in paired with each index. But basically, argmax finds the index of your maximum value. Next, we're going to look at the min function, which finds the minimum value. And we can also do argmin on this one as well, which will find the index of the minimum value. Now we're going to look at random. So np.random is what we're going to start with for creating random arrays from now on. So we're going to start with np.random, and then we're going to say randint. And what this does is it basically finds a random integer between the 2 values that you specify in your parameter. So in this case, it's 19. So we can also supply 3 parameters. So I basically copied and pasted the previous line and just added a 3 to the end, which basically outputs an array with 3 random integers from 5 to 20. Now we're going to look at just rand. And what this does is it outputs an array with length, whatever you specify in your parameter, of values between 0 and 1. And so they're all going to be decimals between 0 and 1. Similar to this, we have np.random.rand with 2 parameters, which is the same concept but a multi-dimensional array. So now we have the same thing, but we're going to add in a little letter here. It's an n. So rand n is, it goes from -1 to 1 instead of 0 to 1. And it still outputs an array with length whatever you specify in the parameter. And we can also make this into a multi-dimensional array. So they're all going to be values between -1 and 1. They're all going to be decimals. Well, that's it for now. If you've enjoyed the content in this video, make sure to give it a like and comment down below any questions you may have. I've also included a little activity in the description box that relates to the skills we learned in this video, so I welcome you to try that out as well. If you're new here, then make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos that'll help you on your journey towards mastering artificial intelligence. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.